All right, should I start? Okay. Welcome. So today I'm going to talk about, so on the schedule it was macro micro, which is kind of like the IIT kind of subtopic. And I'm going to present some historical stuff that we've done. And then the newest work, which we would call the intrinsic unit story, which is on archive. I'm not sure if it's included in the list of readings, so maybe you know about it, maybe you don't. And it should be published soon. All right. Okay, so the intuition or the motivation for the story is that when we study the brain as neuroscientists, or you as neuroscientists, me as not a neuroscientist, we can look at different spatiotemporal scales. We can look at, very coarsely as these different lobes of the brain that we've named, and we can go into kind of more meso scales. We can look at cortical columns and, these kind of canonical microcircuits. We can zoom in further, and those are composed of neurons, and we get in there to a synapse. The neurons are really close and they're sharing neurotransmitters, and those neurotransmitters are made up of very fine molecules and atoms below that. So there's this whole range of scales that we can choose to study the brain at, and depending on what kind of scientist you are, you may use very different scales, right? These are all done in practice. And so the question for us is, if our goal is to understand consciousness, at what scale should we be studying the brain? We could look at neurons, we can look at groups of neurons, molecules, brain regions, but not just spatial scale. All of these things kind of have their associated temporal scale too. Do we want to look at activity on the scale of seconds, milliseconds, tens of milliseconds, picoseconds? Where should we be looking if we want to study consciousness? That's the question. And then so IIT has an answer, not in terms of like what is the scale precisely, but a conceptual answer to this question is, for IIT, the substrate of consciousness is the substrate of units that maximizes phi, maximizes integrated information. And when you're on your first pass through IIT, that's often thought about in terms of where in the brain. Is it neurons in the front or in the back? Is it the whole brain? Is the cerebellum in? Is the cerebellum out? But on a second read through or a second pass of these ideas, we introduced the idea that it's not only which units, but at what grain those units are. So are they neurons in the back? Are they mini columns in the front? So what's the grain of these units? So that's the IIT answer, is that you need to look at all these potential scales and find the one that maximizes integrated information. And so this is kind of colloquially the macro versus micro story for IIT. And the goal here is, so we want to look across scales. Well, we need a framework to do that, right? IIT has a mathematical framework. You get a TPM, you can measure cause-effect power. But now I need to extend that framework that allows me to take that base TPM, usually starting at the finest level, and search across grains. I need to have a substrate for measuring macro cause-effect power. And then we say, the macro substrate beats the corresponding micro substrate if it has higher integrated information. You start with something very micro, and then maybe you go up to a meso level, and then here's where you find your maximum, and then you could go coarser, but at that point, the integrated information starts going down. And there's no necessarily that it has to be this one peak, right? It's not a convex function of grain or so. And there was a sequence of papers. The first person to really work on this was Eric Howell, who had a paper in 2013, and then another one in 2016. And then there's my paper on black boxing, which came out in 2018, which is one of the journal club presentations. And so the general idea in these papers or in this framework is we start at a micro scale, a micro grain. We have a bunch of micro units, and we want to analyze the system across scales. And so we need to map from micro scale to macro scale. And that mapping typically has two different components to it. One is we have to say, okay, well, which units are we going to group together, right? Which neurons come together to make this kind of column? So here we've got A and B mapping to some alpha, and C and D mapping to some beta. very standard is using Greek letters for macro units for whatever reason. That's what we call the spatial grain, how many of these units spatially are being mapped together. But there's also the temporal grain that we get through the state mapping to say, okay, well, I want to map now the states of AB to the states of alpha. And when I make that mapping, it could be for one state, I could have a micro-temporal grain still. The grains are kind of orthogonal. I can increase spatial or temporal or both at the same time. But I can also map from sequences of AB to the state of alpha. So, all my neurons are firing or not. Alex, I see you're already trying to ask a question. Or it could be, they're firing at a specific rate, or they fire a specific amount within a chunk of time.
So with a TPM, we're talking about two states. So let's say I use 0, 0 instead of 0, 1, and another. If that's my current, then does the future also have two? In other words, doesn't have to be symmetrical for the state transitions, the grain, the temporal grain. Doesn't have to be the same, or would I have a smaller, big one?
So it does not need to be symmetrical. So I'll talk a bit more about that, but as the framework has been developing in the latest iteration, which I will get to, we can, the temporal grain, not only of the macro units, can be even different for different macro units in a system. So we have no assumption of homogeneity of spatial or temporal grain. And we'll see that as it comes. Okay, so we're going to start with micro. We're going to map to macro. And in the work of Eric Hoel and my black boxing paper, we identified two canonical types of units that we studied. And one of them, so I'll start the coarse grain, and this is what you would typically see in physics, I think, as, when you think of like temperature and kinetic energy. I'm not a physicist, as like one of the kind of standard ideas of macroness, where you've kind of got this homogeneous groups of units where the average is a very good description of all of them, and averaging serves to reduce noise. And here we call these coarse grains because that's basically what you're doing, is you're averaging to reduce noise, things that are behaving homogeneously. Whereas the prototypical black box is more like something you would see in biology, where you have specialized sequences of units that perform some kind of function. And you want to say, okay, these two take inputs and they project here, and then they project here, and then this final neuron is the one that makes the decision. And so really, in terms of the downstream function, all I care about is what this does, and all the rest of the box is just kind of facilitating the computation the unit is doing. And so these are kind of more something you would expect to say biologists might resonate with more than the coarse grain. So these were the two types of units that we studied originally. Here's an example from Eric's 2016 paper, where we had three groups of units, A, B, C, D, and E, F, and they're kind of pairwise doing the same thing. You can see by the connectivity structure that they kind of have the same inputs and outputs. And then when we macro them into alpha, beta, and gamma, we find the corresponding increase in phi. And for those of you who have been in the IIT sphere for long enough, you'll recognize this is kind of like vintage 3.0 style visualization of this. All right, so for coarse graining, and we've shown that the macro can beat the micro, and I kind of skipped over this, but it's actually a very important question. I feel like there's a slide that is supposed to be there that's missing. I don't know what happened to it, but that's why I missed it. There's this, and Hedda talked about it. I lost her visually, she's here, but there's this, micro assumption, reductionist assumption of causal closure, that all the causal work happens at the micro grain. So one kind of very reasonable perspective is to say, well, you'll never increase causal power by going macro. And depending on your framework, that is certainly true, right? If you're just a pure information theorist, like Shannon information, you're never gaining anything by going up in scale, really. And so even just as a proof of principle, this was important to say it's even a coherent idea to look at macro grains and assess their causal power. So with integrated information, and we see that we can have increased causal power. And how does it do it? Well, it does it by increasing determinism, which is kind of like your the ability to specify a particular state in the future, and also reducing degeneracy, where degeneracy is kind of just like backwards determinism. It's where could I have come from, and I make that more specific. So I have kind of more precise information in both cases. Do I want to click this or not?
Just close it. Just close it later. Just remind.
Click nothing. All right, go away. Okay, and then here's just an example of black boxing, which shows it. Oh, yeah.
Just to why decrease degeneracy?
So within why does that help? So in IIT, we've got cause effect power. So your effect power is kind of like, how well can you say what comes next? And your cause power is kind of how well can you say what came before you? And decreasing degeneracy is kind of making that more specific. So here's this example from the black boxing paper in which this example kind of leveraged the idea of NOR gates as this kind of Turing complete idea. Yes? Yeah, so determinism would be kind of like how well you can specify the future. And degeneracy is like, so a degenerate system is one where you could have come from many possible past states, like anything in the past could have happened. So when you reduce degeneracy, it's kind of like you're increasing backwards determinism. You're saying, I know exactly where I came from. Whereas a degenerate system, you don't know where you came from. You could have come from any number of states in the past. So So let's say I'm in the on state here. If all of the previous states all lead to on, then I'm degenerate. I don't know if I've ever said it like that. But it means that I could have come from anywhere. And so I don't have any causal power to specify where I came from. Whereas if I have a unique state I could have come from, I've reduced my degeneracy, then I have more power to specify what happened in the past. And so this is one of the kind of unique ideas of IIT, which has nothing to do with macro micro per se, but that we kind of sit at the present and we look both forward, but also backwards. That's certainly a unique feature of the theory. Okay, so this example leverages this idea that NOR gates are kind of universal gates that you can stack them together to basically build everything. And we stack from a bunch of NOR gates, which turn into OR and AND gates, which eventually turn into majority gates. And we start with a modest microphi, and then actually goes down at the meso level here, but then it peaks at the majority scale. And again, these are now black boxes in the sense that they have inputs, and these, just like these peaks here, are the outputs of the function. They're the ones that are implementing the majority logic. And we show again that macro can beat micro. And this time, how does it do it? So when we say in the previous, when we increase determinism, reduce degeneracy, that's kind of information. We're increasing information. Now, we're not changing information. We're actually changing integration. We're making our system more interrelated. There are less kind of fault lines or weak links in the system. And so here, when you cut, you can kind of cut out and isolate like one kind of minimal unit when you partition the system. But here, when you cut, no matter how you cut it, you're always cutting, 3 inputs to a majority gate, and you're basically saying, okay, you lose what that majority gate does. So it becomes a much more integrated system, and as a result, has more integrated information, which for us is causal power. But again, not everyone considers integrated information causal power. They're different frameworks.
And this is the 2018 version.
Yeah, this is 2018 version.
So it doesn't have anything to do with the relation.
Yeah, there's no relations. Well, yeah, there's no relations haven't even been published yet here. They're not in here at all.
But still, more inputs on the one output is increased.
Yeah, they increase phi in this sense. Okay, so here's an intermediate prompt slide for you. So we've shown that causal power can peak at macro scales. So something we can think about is, if we've got a real system, how can we efficiently identify good candidates of potential macro units? Can we use these known features like determinism and degeneracy and fault lines? Something that seems natural to me. Can we use the tools and algorithms from graph theory to kind of find fault lines, maximum modularity, partitions, things like that? Yeah. just means like that the system can be easily cut apart. So if you imagine you had a grid, right? That's kind of just a well-made lattice. It has no fault lines. Everything is kind of like equally interconnected. But then imagine you have two lattices with one line, one connection in the middle. And I would call that a fault line. It's a very weak link in the system. And if you were to, build the system with toothpicks, it would very quickly break along that line. So it's kind of like a weak point in the system is what I'm trying to. So the way you see it here is, let's say I was to cut out just one of these NOR gates here. It only does one thing. Its output is one thing. So it's only got one connection you're losing. So that's a fault line. But here, if I cut out a macro unit, every macro unit outputs to other macro units. So I have to cut at least, I think, 3 things no matter what I cut here. Whereas here, I can cut just one thing. So this is kind of more well interconnected. This has kind of some weak links. It has some heavily interconnected parts, but for IIT, you're always cutting the weakest link.
That it could theoretically fluctuate for most effective various.
So the idea when we'll come to the newest framework is that, so you want to find the grain that maximizes phi. And then that's where we say we should study consciousness. Now, that could be neurons, it could be mini columns, it could be a mixture of neurons and mini columns. It doesn't have to be like one extrinsically defined consistent grain. Oh, sorry, Alex, you're jumping the line.
Are you like assessing the irreducibility of these more macro scales? Are you still partitioning at the micro scale, or are you watching macro?
I'm going to just kick the can on that one. I'm going to talk about it.
Doesn't the primary depend on the state of the unit though?
Yeah, for sure.
So that's related to this question, right? So the same, depending on the states of the units, you get different parameters.
Yeah, so different states may lead to different answers to where the maximum is.
So when you have an effect problem. So if you wanna do this graining, it depends on the states of the units. Right now with this.
No, I mean, all of these computations are done for a specific state.
But it's with a different state, you get a different phi value, so maybe then you also get a different answer for your cross grading.
Yeah.
So then it's nice to do the cross grading.
Well, you do it on a state-by-state basis.
Oh.
Yeah.
Are we generally saying when we macro the units that we're also macroing the states so that like we still have 2 states?
Gonna kick that one too. That's coming. Okay, so there's my first problem slide. All right, so I'm gonna present a few kind of technical notes that kind of lead into the new work. So in the Hoel papers, we had a restrictions on the mappings from micro to macro. So people who have read these will maybe remember them. And the idea was for coarse graining that when you would map, let's say, 2 microstates, 1, 0 and 0, 1, you had to map them to the same macro state, because not doing so would be akin to like going inside and like using the micro identities to make the mapping and kind of bringing micro level cause effect power, micro level information up to the macro grain. And so we had this restriction on how you could map the system to basically prevent that from happening. And so all microstates that had kind of the same number of on units had to go to the same macro state. That was a restriction in these papers. This is just a new figure kind of illustrating that. And then in the black boxing paper, we had this other kind of technical note to say, well, when we cut between the macro units, we needed to cut between the micro units, called the micro cuts. And the idea there was, if you don't allow some kind of cutting through the micro units, you could have a situation where you have 2 completely unrelated systems, but I just grouped together unrelated things. And I've kind of created integration. I've created integration where there was none before by drawing some arbitrary box around them. And so we said, well, that's kind of feels wrong. It feels like it's kind of going against what we're trying to capture. So we introduced these micro cuts. Okay, so those when you read those papers, these come across as too technical notes. And now I want to reframe them, not as technical notes, but as conceptual notes. So we have this restrictions on the mapping to ensure that micro cause effect power is not leaking into macro systems. I want to say that's intrinsicality. That means when I am measuring the intrinsic cause effect power of the macro system, it needs to be the cause effect power that belongs to the macro system intrinsically, not the micro system. So I want to reframe this as simply something that is about intrinsicality. And when I cut through the micro units, where I'm trying to stop kind of aggregation of unrelated units, this is integration. So these kind of technical notes in the papers are really conceptual notes about how we are implementing the postulates in the procedure. And that kind of motive,
So this is something that some kind of technique you do to create the macro candidate, let's say, in Qstr-IIT?
yes. So these originally they show up as just as like aspects of the mathematical framework, right? Of course, there's a mathematical framework that goes underneath all this, and they show up there. And now I'm taking those kind of things that were presented as just part of the mathematical framework and bringing them into like the conceptual part of the theory as well.
The next question, doesn't this kind of automatically happen when you want to try to find the best macro subdivision? I mean, if you don't follow one of those rules, don't you have a non-increasing price user is automatically discarded?
No, it very much depends on how you operationalize the process. Okay. Yeah.
So why system 5, not tree 5? It's related to what now said, right? So you said when you do all of this in your system 5, but that's before you unfold, so the relations don't matter.
Yeah. So relations don't matter, that's true. So this is about finding the complex, right? So in IIT, first we find the complex, then we unfold. So I'm only on the finding the complex part of the process.
But then you stick to that. You don't unfold when you step 5.
Well, so let me get there. It'll come. Kicking that one too. All right. So new paper that's coming out. This intrinsic units. It's a unified framework. So one of the things that this does. So it's got kind of two important goals to it. So one is to take those two ideas of a coarse grain and a black boxing and embed them into a unified framework where those are now just two special cases of a more generalized form of macro unit. And the second goal is to take those conceptual points and kind of flesh that out fully in terms of aligning with the postulates. So now we're going to have a macro unit, for example, a neuron or a transistor, and we're going to define it precisely. It's going to have a set of constituents. So what are its spatial kind of micro constituents? It's going to have a temporal grain. It's going to have exactly two states. So we are saying they're binary macro units. And then it's going to have a mapping from the states of its spatial constituents over its temporal grain to the state of the macro unit. And some of those mappings will be what we previously called coarse grains, and some of them will be what we previously called black boxes, and some of them will be some kind of middle ground between the two. Okay. And then linking them now to the postulates, rather than kind of these kind of like piecemeal approach to it, we're going to say, no, let's just make sure that we're satisfying the postulates throughout. So a macro unit should be intrinsic, specific, irreducible. Well, that simply means having positive phi. That's what those postulates mean when we operationalize them. So now the units themselves, when I take the units that constitute a macro unit, they should be integrated. They should have phi. What about definite when I come to exclusion? Well, I can't say that they should be the global maximum because, of course, then you get this circular problem where the system you're building to be the global maximum kind of excludes its own units. And we came up with this notion of maximally irreducible within, meaning it's not a global maximum, but it's the best you can do using only the units you're working with and the temporal grain you're working with and within it. So it's greater phi than any other kind of unit that could be defined from within it. So you're always kind of building up as you go and you build. And one of the ways I like to think about this is it means you can't build something out of nothing, right? If satisfying the postulates is what it means to exist intrinsically, then that means that you're always building things that exist out of other things that exist. So cause effect power or turtles all the way down. One of the, if you think about this maximally irreducible within ideas, one of the kind of metaphors that I like is to say, you want to say a house exists, right? Houses are built out of bricks, not always, but let's say you've got a brick house. Well, if I take my house and I deconstruct it, I better find bricks. That's kind of the idea here. If I take apart my house and there were never any bricks to begin with, then something's kind of not right.
Yeah. Okay. Question. So David answered later in this computer, but when you have that really defined as the positive power, and then based on what we discussed in the second session after the end of school, the intrinsicality of the relation is something that we have been discussing. And to have a positive power, don't you need to have not only brick, but the other side, the thing that brick affects, or brick is affected. So the positive power is the relation itself rather than thing itself. And then if that's the case, then the building something out of nothing, something is about the relations, then building this brick out of the relations is not building something out of nothing, right?
So rather than answer it, it's a good question. And so basically this is my next prompt slide. I'm gonna pass that on to the students to think about a bit. So I can't answer it because it's part of the homework. So, but it is a good question. So to think about this idea of something out of nothing, I'll get to it. So yep.
Yeah. Intrinsic, as I was using it, because in this context, to be intrinsic is to have causal power on yourself. Like there's a relational property, except the relation is towards yourself.
Mm-hmm.
But on my sort of absolute intrinsicality notion, makes the problem not being prompted by religion at all. So maybe that's useful to clarify.
Yeah. Yeah. Self-relation versus.
It is different. That came up with the questions.
Okay. Yep, I agree. So, so here's kind of just a little play out of what this might look like. So here's a schematic figure. So let's say we want to make these macro units. Well, in this case, these macro units are not integrated. There's no connection going from A to C. So because they're not integrated, they don't have phi. If I treat them as a system, they can't be macro units. Next, here they are integrated, but they're not maximally irreducible within. What do I mean by that? Well, the phi of AC is 0.005, but if I treat A by itself, it's 0.02. So A by itself is more integrated. So this is not definite in a sense. There's why do I choose the unit I choose? Well, it has to have a reason. We have the maximal existence. So here, these units are integrated, but they're not definite. They don't satisfy irreducibility within, so they're not eligible to be macro units. And then here, AC has a stronger connection, so we get a phi of 0.16. I'm losing my eyesight for sure. But here now A is just 0.02. So here they are maximally irreducible within. So good, they satisfy our postulates. These are now macro units that we can work with and check as a system. How does this alpha beta have cause effect power? And this is a recreation of one of the earliest examples, but now within this framework. So this was our coarse graining example, but it's slightly different, more noisier now. Everything's got self loops to kind of satisfy all of these cause effect power requirements. But we have A, B, and C, D both kind of performing very similar functions. They're kind of AND gates, which means on leads to on and everything else leads to off. So we take the mapping that kind of matches the intended function. We check, we've got phi A, phi AB, phi ABC. We see that AB are hopeful macro units are maximally irreducible within. They beat everything within them. They also beat the bigger system. That's not strictly necessary. And so we can look at the system as alpha beta. And when we do so, we find that phi of alpha beta has a phi of about 1, phi of the individual macro units, 0.01, phi of the whole system, 0.02. So across grains, we find the maximum at macro system alpha beta. So still, cause effect power can peak at macro grains. All right, so here's my prompt slide, touching on what Now said and what Hedda said. So how does this relate to the metaphysics or the ontology of IIT? Relationship with Hedda's talk yesterday. What is the ontological status of the intrinsic macro units? How does that status relate to their constituting micro units? If cause effect power all the way down, what does the bottom look like? Is there a bottom? Like some of these answers I have opinions on, some of them are more speculative, but I kind of just tossing out there for the people who are interested in this aspect. This is a great place to spend some discussion time, I think. All right, so within this framework, it allows that macro units can be made directly from micro units, but we can also have a series of intermediate meso units. And which way we build our macro units now is constrained by the framework. It depends which of these options satisfy maximally irreducible within. Right, so if the micro units beat the meso units, then I can't make the meso units and I can't use them to build a macro unit. I have to go right from kind of micro to macro. But if I have a hierarchy of micro, meso beats micro, and then macro beats meso, then I can build up in a hierarchy. And which way I choose is kind of constrained by the theory, but it also has an impact in terms of what mappings are possible in terms of states. It all kind of matters when you kind of flesh everything out. And so do we have a hierarchy of units? Do we have some, intrinsic cause effect power at some atomic scale, some atoms of cause effect power, which group up into neurotransmitters, which can then group up into neurons, which maybe group up into mini columns? And so here's my prompt slide, and this I'll talk about. So what are the intrinsic units in the brain? What are we looking for now with this new kind of framing of the problem? Could a neuron be an intrinsic unit? Do we have cause effect power at a neuron? Does it make sense to treat it as an integrated system? And how might one kind of search for this hierarchy of units? And this is a slide for anyone who was here in 2023 when we did the summer school. This was presented by Albert Giddon. I don't know if I'm saying that right. He's a postdoc in Matthew Larkham's lab, in which he kind of unprompted and unrelated to my kind of ongoing work on this, presented different models, dendritic models of a neuron, and had concluded that this recurrent model had phi and was his kind of best model for the neuron. So he kind of was preempting me and saying, well, maybe there's a version of this where when we study the neurons, when we actually take the parts of the neurons and treat them as a system, we will find that a neuron is an integrated thing. That's kind of future work, but it's got to come if this framework is right. Well, or they're not neurons, but there's another prompt slide. And now the kind of here we're going to get a little bit into like, how do I actually do this? How am I measuring cause effect power? And I don't have time, nor do I think it's kind of effective in this context to rigorously go through the framework, although I'm happy to take questions on that kind of offline. But I want to give some like high-level description of how we measure macro cause effect power, because I find it to be very informative in thinking about certain aspects. So, we've got some micro units, some might map to meso units, which might map to macro units. And here is cause effect power in terms of, okay, I have a current state. Well, what does my current state look like? So if we kind of discretize time here into some kind of micro update interval. So at the micro level, I have the smallest possible state. And then I want to know what's my effect, what's my next state, and what's my cause, what's my previous state. As I go up in scale, we're always kind of living in the current, right? It's always about what am I now? What am I conscious of now? So my meso state, still the end of that state, which might be 10 milliseconds of neural activity, the end of that state aligns with the end of the microstate. That's the now. And then if it's this long, then its future state is bigger because its future state is also meso and its past state is larger. So then if I go up to a macro state, again, my current state grows. It kind of rides the wave of the current micro update. And then I have this larger, longer effect state and this longer cause state that precedes me. So that's how when I start talking about cause effect power, how do I constrain my past and future states, making a macro TPM? These are the past and future states. These are the transitions, right? The transitions are growing as I go across the scale.
You cannot have a short, still a long future.
Yeah, no, because for every unit, the unit is kind of defined. It's definite as the specific unit that maximizes cause effect power. And so its past and future are kind of part of what it is. All right, so how do we do this? Yep.
For the relative length of the macro is what you can expect to it. You think it's always going to be.
This is just this is a schematic as to like. Yeah. So how do we go and measure cause effect power? And this is going to connect to something somebody asked before, but I've lost the thread of what the question was, but I remember it was important for this. So we start with a micro TPM, right? We start our process at the micro level. We have a micro TPM. I'm going to kind of say this, and then I'm going to expand on this on the next slide. So there are certain connections at the micro level that I'm going to claim won't be intrinsic to the macro level, and they need to be discounted. That's the first step. Once they've been discounted, now I can take my micro TPM and extend it to a sequence of microstates to sequence of microstates TPM, right? Transition probability matrices, they're matrices, you matrix multiplication, and you get longer sequences of transitions. So I can extend it. Once I've extended it, now I'm going to marginalize my background conditions. And the ordering here is kind of important because in IIT, we fix the background conditions in their current state when we're looking at a micrograin. Now at a macrograin, we are still conditioning on the current state of the universe, the context, but we do allow them to kind of propagate, to percolate, I think is the terminology we use to say, okay, you're definitely starting at this point, but they are allowed to kind of percolate and facilitate the interactions, right? If you imagine you have two intrinsic units that are neurons, but you absolutely freeze the vacuum of space in the synapse between them, and you don't allow anything to kind of percolate through it, then you can never have any kind of cause effect power. So the background conditions, while you are still anchoring the current state of them, they are allowed to kind of percolate. And so that's why they get marginalized after we extend to sequences. And then once you've marginalized them, now you've got sequences of microstates to sequences of microstates, and then you do the mapping from micro to macro, and you end up with a macro TPM. And once you've got those macro TPMs, then you just throw it into PyPhi as if it was just a TPM and calculate. So all of the work of extending this framework is in generating the macro TPMs. And then once you've got it, you can just treat it as a TPM as though you did any other system you've studied IIT with. So it's the TPM goes in, you compute its system phi, you unfold its cause effect structure, everything else proceeds as it would have if it was a grain agnostic TPM. So all the work is in generating this macro TPM. Yep.
So basically, this goes with what we said. The main thing is that what you're doing is you're taking your macro TPM and then you're examining whether you build something out of nothing.
Yep.
And you make sure you didn't, and then you get the TPM that you actually want to work with.
Yep.
Is that also the reason why you start with the macro? Couldn't you also maybe start with the micro and work your way up to a macro?
No, well, then you start with the micro, and then you map to macro. And in the process of doing the mapping, you're checking to make sure you're not building something out of nothing.
So when you say get a macro TPM, that's not the first step.
No, you've got a micro TPM, and then how do you get a macro TPM? These are the steps to getting it.
And how do you deal with the problem that you have to grade both space and time? So you have a combinatorial space of grading.
Yes, that is a problem. Maybe I'll prompt you to think about it. So these a few slides later, but I said we were going to discount some connections. So this is from the paper. I'm not going to go through this in heavy detail, but we've got these kind of sample systems, and we're asking about, what is intrinsic to the macro system. And another way, I think an easier way to frame this is whenever we are making the mapping, we're thinking about the micro units and making sure we're not double counting their cause effect power. That's kind of like a clear way to say that we're extracting kind of too much out of the micro level is if we're double counting it. And so if I take this system, actually I should look here, it'd be easier. All right. So this macro unit here, if I'm asking about cause effect power on gamma, how gamma is being affected, I've got this direct from alpha to gamma connection that is green. I'm going to leave it intact. But if my time scale is 2 units, alpha can also go through beta to get to gamma. And here's my claim. It's like one thing I'm going to say about this is, if I want to know how does alpha affect gamma, I want the direct connection, not the mediated through beta connection that's coming through. Because in that sense, I would be kind of this unit within beta, I would be double counting its cause effect power, both as a direct effect onto C or onto gamma, but also as a mediator of alpha's effect on gamma. So it starts playing 2 roles in the system. And that's kind of, if you wanted to kind of have a very kind of concise way of thinking about it, when I'm discounting some of these, I'm looking what role is the micro unit playing and saying it can't play more than one role. It's either a mediator of something or it has direct cause effect power, but I don't count it as both a mediating effect and a direct effect. And so that, I think we need a lot more math to do that. So I can't really give too much more on that, but again, if you want to follow up on that, I'm happy to talk about it.
I don't do it all.
So the idea is that, so it's related to this notion of intrinsicality. And if maybe I kind of by analogy, I go to this, this state mapping with the coarse graining where I say, okay, I want to capture macro cause effect power, which is, okay, how does the macro system constrain itself in the past and in the future? And if I'm kind of allowing myself to kind of use the full description of the microsystem, this is the example that I think is most powerful. So I've got this system, and this is more about state, but it kind of plays the same role here. So I've got this system of micro units. Its intrinsic information is 3 bits. It's kind of got the maximum information you can have. And when you cut it, you find its integrated information is 0.83 bits. If I have this unrestricted macroing where all I do is let anything happen and just map straight from micro TPM to macro TPM without discounting everything, what I can do is say, okay, let's just draw a boundary around this. And instead of having some coarse graining mapping, let's just map these 8 possible microstates to one macro unit with 8 states. Just renaming the states. But now what's happened is it's a monad. It has no external connections, and I'm not cutting it anymore, right? I've already validated that it's an intrinsic unit. And so as a monad, all of its intrinsic information becomes integrated information. And when I do this, I think it's clear that here, this is just all micro cause effect power, micro information that's being kind of smuggled up and hidden inside a macro unit. And we kind of thought a lot about this and how to kind of have an honest calculation that's saying, okay, this is truly macro cause effect power. And the 2 parts that come out of that is the restrictions on the state mapping and the restrictions on micro units playing more than one role. And those come out of it. And that's kind of where I think I'll leave it for now.
But aren't you bringing some kind of extrinsic or God view on a distinction between the 1 unit of the 8 states versus actually 3 unit plus, 2 states each distribution?
Sorry, say it again.
Like, if you're not involved or if you don't know what's happening and then things there taking 8 different kind of states versus, actually this is, composed of 3 units inside with 2 states each.
So you're saying, how would I know that there's something? Yeah. So
This system itself.
the system itself cannot know. I mean, this is a tricky thing to say, but it's kind of I think the argument is best seen in the kind of restriction on the state mapping, where we now say a system has exactly, a unit has exactly two states. And we make the argument that to have more than two states, it's just this and not this, not even this and that, right? It's either one thing or not that thing.